And
Yep.
I have to say it. I know the audience likes it when we throw in a little comic relief. But every time I think of this case, I hear Gomer Pyle's voice saying, "Citizens arrest! Citizens arrest!"
That's exactly what I thought of when I saw their mugshots.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hi, folks. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, you know all the rest. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 227, and it's our long overdue Clinging to God and Gun show with your friend and mine, the pistol packing padre, Pastor John Bennett. Pastor, it's so good to get back together with you.
It is. It is. And one of the greatest joys is that we aren't dead yet.
That's right.
If you listen to all the politicians and the news media, we should, it should be like one of these post-apocalyptic movies where you're walking through a wasteland of dead corpses. So
Texas should be completely wiped out by now. I don't know how it is that we've survived down here.
Well, probably because it's not a Democrat-run state yet, but
well, it's close. Wheels is doing his best to pretend to be one.
Well, if you think your governor is bad, just remember it could be worse.
It could be a lot worse.
Yes, there's Gavin Newsom. There's there's my wonderful governor. Of course, I say that with all sarcasm. So,
and then there's Governor Cuomo.
Yeah,
and yeah, it could be far worse. You're right. You are right. It's really cool to be back together. Things are finally getting back on track. The house repairs are progressing, and family's all back together from North Carolina, and we're in temporary housing together. But we're still probably 2 months out from making this house livable. I'm recording from my partially demolished house. The only good audio space I've got is in my office. So they've got most of the drywall. Well, actually, they got all the drywall done, all the painting done. They just have to do doors and baseboards. And the worst is going to be the cabinets. The cabinets are going to take forever.
Well, hey, look at the bright side. If you wanted new cabinets, you're going to get them now, right?
Hey, exactly. Anyway, we are back together partly thanks to the awesome contributions of the men and women who are members of the Reformation Gun Club. I want to thank them for their support throughout all of this craziness, not changing the schedule and our financial craziness that's going on in the country right now. This week, I do want to give a special shout out to Melvin and Jim and Jackie and Dan and Lee and Diane, Tyler, Sam, Kurt, and our newest member, Mark from Woodland, Washington. Thank you all so much for your support. If you value what we do and you'd enjoy some cool benefits like early access to the show and access to our closed Facebook and MeWe groups, invites to monthly online hangouts, which we're going to be starting back again soon. We've put them on hiatus, of course, because of all the craziness going on with my house, but that's going to get back up and running here before long. Plus, access to hundreds of hours of exclusive content with new content released every week in addition to the regular show. Come join us for as little as $1 a month. Check out all the benefits and the details at armedlutheran.us/gun club. All right, we're back to full strength, unadulterated, clinging to God and guns for a change. Unadulterated is a great term. It's not used enough. I honestly don't even remember what it means, but it seems to fit because what is it? Like no adults were involved, right? That's what unadulterated means.
Yeah,
you do have to wonder sometimes.
Maybe. Yeah, I think it means like pure as the driven snow, like the opposite of messing around in an adulterous fashion.
Ah, okay. All right, very good.
So yes, it is unadulterated because it will be pure as the driven snow, right?
That's exactly right. Absolutely, completely pure. Not an improper thing said or thought. No, we're totally PC here. So a lot has happened since we were together last. Much of it we have not really had a chance to comment on, and I mentioned way back when I first was on vacation in North Carolina that we would do some of this. We'd talk about some of this stuff and catch up on it. But a question from one of our listeners, Dana from Long Beach, California, kind of gives us the perfect vehicle for this discussion. Dana writes, "Hi guys, thank you for all you do each week. The commandments tell us we shall not murder. So as Christians, what should your mindset be if the occasion arises where you have to use deadly force to defend yourself? Thank you. Keep up the good work, Dana." Okay. So we discussed a little bit. You have to go way back to get to the discussion. Episode 85 in September of 2017, we had a show called A Christian View of Home Defense. But it would do for us to sort of revisit the topic and expand it based on some of the events that we've seen in recent months. We're not going to get into the specifics of these cases. Like, I thought we would generalize them a little bit because I think there are lessons that we can learn both as gun owners and as Christians. So let's start out, Pastor, with one going all the way back to before all the madness started. Out of Georgia, let's put ourselves into the shoes of some of the people in these situations or in these stories. You live in a community where there have been a number of break-ins, and you don't feel like the police have done enough to protect your property, and you come across this stranger who just appears to be casing homes in the neighborhood. Maybe he's trespassed on somebody's property. Maybe you live in a state that allows you to perform a citizen's arrest and detain someone suspected of a crime. You're not law enforcement yourself. You see this guy that you suspect is casing homes. As a responsible gun owner, as a Christian, what's the proper way to handle this? Do you confront the guy? Do you brandish a weapon? Do you attempt to detain him? What's the mindset going into this kind of situation?
Well, first and foremost, what you shouldn't do is jump in your pickup truck with your guns and chase the guy down in a residential area. That's like the absolute stupidest thing to do. There's a saying that I've been using more frequently.
How did you figure out what story I was talking about?
Well, because
you must be a mind reader.
My mind jumped immediately to that case. But it's the saying that I've been using more frequently these days is, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And this is a case where these guys had a vigilante mindset that they were going to, because cops weren't there to do their job, they were going to do it for them. And if that's your mindset, it usually doesn't lead anywhere good. You should never presume to even consider the use of deadly force in order to protect property. It's just plain stupid. And the fact that these two guys decided to do this, I mean, there was the premeditation there involved of, let's get our guns, let's hop on our pickup truck, and let's chase the guy down.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I got into it with a guy on Facebook because he insisted that this was, totally legitimate shooting, there's no question as to the moral nature of it. But here's where I come down to the criticism of the gentleman involved. That young man would still be alive, and they could have been a good witness to law enforcement, given the description of the guy. They could have even, taken their cell phones to get pictures of him and so forth. And
they had a friend with a cell phone with them.
Yeah, they did. Why wasn't it good enough just to take a picture and say, here's the guy? Or let's get in our vehicle and we'll just, follow him and see where he goes. And when police arrive, we can point them in the direction of where he's at.
Yep.
It's when you get your gun to go confront someone who may or may not be a criminal, even though the appearance is such that they may be up to no good, it doesn't justify the stupidity that led to the necessity of taking that young man's life. I'm not going to say that the young man, I'm not going to say that he was entirely innocent, because the evidence suggests that when he was confronted by one of the armed men, that he got into a physical altercation and got control of the firearm. And so there are no innocent parties in this, the way that I look at it.
No. But like you said, he would still be alive. There's no he should not have died for trespassing or even, casing somebody's house, thinking that he might later even if we assume that was what he was up to, he shouldn't have died for it.
Right.
And
right.
And the fact that and the lesson, and I think there's a thread here you'll see through a lot of these stories that we'll share with you today, is that when you bring a gun into any confrontation, you had better be prepared to use it, because you've now sort of drawn a line in the sand that you can't back away from.
Yes,
right?
And I would add to that, be willing to accept the legal ramifications of your actions.
Yes, even more important. Yes, exactly right. Because once you go to the gun, where do you go next?
Right.
If the guy calls your bluff, you're now forced to use your firearm in a situation where you probably didn't need to. And in this case, clearly, despite all the people who want to defend these yahoos, they should never have brandished a firearm. I don't care what the law says, and you're exactly right. We may even name this episode "Just Because You Can Doesn't Mean You Should." That's a perfect title for based on the... Just because, like you said, just because you the law says you can defend property, or you can, like here in Texas, you can defend property with a firearm, depending on how it's done. Obviously, you can't go chase somebody down because they stole your TV and shoot them, but there's this idea in certain states that you can defend property or your home with a firearm when there's not a deadly threat directly to you. You have this situation, and this was Georgia, where you are legally allowed to act in the place of law enforcement, essentially. But just because the law says you can, doesn't mean that you should go out and try it, because the consequences could be really, really dire.
Right. And I would go so far as to say that if a succession of very bad decisions leads to the death of another person, whether or not in the strict sense of the law it was justified, to me, that succession of bad decisions makes you culpable for the death of the other person.
Yeah.
So, and yep. I have to say it. I know the audience likes it when we throw in a little comic relief, but every time I think of this case, I hear Gomer Pyle's voice saying, "Citizens arrest! Citizens arrest!"
That's exactly what I thought of when I saw their mugshots.
And for any of you who don't get that reference, I'm jealous, because you're obviously much younger than I am.
Right. All right. So the next example, and this is the one that I think was the last thing that happened, and this is the thing that really got the country stirred up and sort of lit a match to what was already a short fuse. Again, without getting into specifics, let's put ourselves in the position of the guy with the camera, observing police manhandling a suspect and using what looks like force that's probably more than necessary. And the suspect is pinned to the ground. He begins to complain that he can't breathe, but the officer doesn't relent. And the man stopped. He's no longer resisting. He's handcuffed, and he's pleading with the officer that he can't breathe, to get off of him. Now we all know what this case is. You know what we're referring to, but I remember seeing, and I don't know whether you remember seeing it, there was some discussion about what should you have done, what could, because the whole country, left and right, pro-gun, anti-gun, doesn't matter. Everybody, pro-police, anti-police, everybody was up in arms about this case originally and unified that this, in our opinion, that this was a bad situation. This was something that should never have happened. And it's gone kind of sideways from there. But there was some discussion I remember seeing, and I don't remember who posted the thread and the kind of a thought experiment, but what should you do? What would you do if you're a citizen and you see this happening and you see one of your fellow citizens being abused and potentially dying? There may be a three estates, kind of two kingdoms argument here. What is a Christian as a citizen of both the kingdom of the left and the kingdom of the right? We care about people. We don't want to see them die, but we also want to see the government fulfill their role to punish the wicked and work for our good. But when we see them doing things that aren't good, what should be our thought process about this? What should be our response? Should we sit back and kind of shrug and say, wow, that's really sad? Should we attempt somehow to intervene, either physically or verbally? What's the best way to think about this?
Well, and I think of Luther's section on the fifth commandment within the Large Catechism, where he, just to paraphrase, says that if you are in a position to preserve your neighbor's life and you do nothing, it would be as if you had killed him yourself. And, I don't want to say that anyone other than the officers involved are responsible for the death of George Floyd, but I would say that you have a responsibility as a Christian to do something. And standing there with your cell phone and yelling at the cops, that to me doesn't equate to doing something. That you can step in and intervene in a way that is both lawful and responsible, which might actually have a good outcome. The best, and I can't remember where I saw this on Facebook. Obviously, I can't remember the exact wording of it. But to approach the officers in a non-threatening way and say, of course, if you want to lie, I'm not going to tell you one way or the other what to do as far as that's concerned. But if you are a trained first responder, for example, and my training might be at this point 23 years out of date, but you can still see the signs when someone is in medical distress. To approach the police officers, hands out at your side so that they can clearly see that you're not armed, and say, hey, I'm a trained first responder. He is in medical distress. His life is at risk. Do you mind if I assess him? At this point, the guy is already in cuffs. There's not much that he can do to endanger the lives of the officers involved. And this is, if there is anybody in this country that in any way finds that those actions were justified, I pity you, because that was a clear-cut example where a person was no longer a threat and excessive force was still applied.
Right.
And look at the turmoil that it has led to in our country.
Yeah, and this is where, you remember, I don't know how many times Aaron Israel would talk about when he was a member of the cast. One of the things that he would always kind of harp on was, your tools and your skills beyond the gun are probably going to be more important than the gun itself, right? You're probably more likely to need a first aid kit. You're probably more likely to need first aid training. So this is a perfect example of maybe go out and get some training and be able to assist in these sorts of situations. It might be a situation like the cases we've seen just this week where police officers were ambushed and attacked in Chicago, where you might be able to render aid to an injured police officer. It might be that you could help law enforcement assess an injured citizen while they're waiting for an ambulance to come. It could be a situation like this where you could step in and with some sort of with authority, I don't mean like official authority, but the authority, the confidence of, hey, I'm trained, I know this stuff, I see this person in distress, I recognize the signs. How can I help you to make sure that this person isn't injured further?
Right.
So and by all means, and please understand for those listening, we're not advocating intervening with force in a situation like this.
Yeah, that would not be a good idea.
That would not work out well for you.
No.
Because even if in this case where it's clear that the officer's use of force was excessive, if you jump in and try to help this guy physically, you're going to find yourself tased or beaten yourself and perhaps even shot. So please don't ever try to intervene in that way.
And if they arrest you for intervening in a non-confrontational way, as I described, and it's on camera, guess what? You might have yourself a couple $1,000,000 after the lawsuit. So
right.
And this is probably one of the saddest things that has taken place in our society over the last 20 years, but there is this mentality that so many have adopted of, I just don't want to get involved. And that's not the moral take of the Christian. Now, if it's something where you getting involved means you may have to exercise deadly force and your life is not at risk and no one's life at that point is at risk, don't get involved. I mean, how many stories do we read of people doing stupid stuff like, somebody's getting a little bit out of control and I'm going to pull my gun and hold my gun on them until law enforcement arrives because I'm itching to use my firearm. There's a lot of crazy cowboy stories out there when it comes to cases where there isn't a legitimate use of self-defense.
Right. Yeah, and if you don't know what you're doing with that tool when you do deploy it, it's like you were saying, you're quoting Luther from the Large Catechism. Part of that passage, he talks about it would be like seeing your neighbor in deep water, and you could go out, you could do something to save them from drowning, but you didn't. But if you can't swim,
right,
it doesn't make sense to jump in.
Right.
So get some training. Know what you're doing with your tools.
Yes, and I am not an advocate of you hear some who say, well, if they're going after your property, you have a right to use deadly force, and that's just, you should never, and this gets back to the original question that was posed by Dana, that as a Christian, whenever you are in a situation where self-defense becomes necessary, your intent should never be to end the life of the aggressor, but rather to preserve your own life at all necessary costs, as well as the lives of your loved ones and innocent bystanders and so forth. If there is any possible way to end the confrontation, to stop the aggressor from fulfilling whatever their intentions are without pulling that trigger, that at the end of the day is a really good thing.
Absolutely. Now, that kind of perfectly leads us into the next example, or the next two examples, because unless you've been on another planet or under a rock for the past few months, you know exactly what happened next. All the riots and the looting and the violence and clashes with police, stores and businesses that have been already kind of wiped out by these unconstitutional COVID-19 lockdowns were then burned and looted. And in a number of places, including one that sticks out in my mind here in Dallas, we saw examples of people who attempted to defend their stores. And some of those events, those actions turned out kind of tragic, and they ended up being beaten nearly to death in some cases. We saw kind of celebrations of the so-called roof Koreans from the Rodney King riots in L.A. and suggestions we need more of that today. Others argue, hey, it's just a business, it's just stuff, it's covered by insurance. Why do you care if they burn it down? How should we as Christians think about when we see looting and rioting, and also when it's our business or some place that we work? Do we put ourselves in a position to defend property with potentially deadly force? And we've already sort of alluded to that. But
yeah, and this is one of those scenarios where I myself have a hard time putting myself mentally in that position, because I'm not in that position. I don't have a store that is, threatened by looters. And I would say the best advice that I could possibly give to a situation like that is your life is worth more than what's in that store.
Yep.
And so, yes, it would be absolutely heartbreaking. And there's been many heartbreaking cases. Of course, the saddest part of it has been that many of these businesses, and I think, for example, in just 100 miles from me in Minneapolis, many of these businesses that were burned and looted were businesses owned by black people. And in many cases, it was these communist, fascist Antifa folks. Yes, they are fascists. Fascism, by definition, is using violence to silence your political opponents. But these fascists came in, and these fascist white folk came in and burned black people's businesses. Of course, it wasn't just white people. There was people of all different ethnic backgrounds that were in these mobs of rioters. And so, yeah, that's absolutely heartbreaking. There's cases of people who lost their businesses and did have insurance. But
yeah.
I think of it in the terms of a hurricane. You live in an area where a hurricane is imminent. It's going to strike. You have your business and your home. And what do? You get the heck out of there. Well, in these cases, you have a tsunami of violent people. And why are you going to try and stick around and use deadly force against a tsunami of violent people who wouldn't think twice about harming or killing you if you were to show any signs of aggression toward them? It's heartbreaking. I wouldn't want anybody to lose their livelihood. But at the same time, I'd rather see someone lose their livelihood than lose their life.
Absolutely. And speaking of property, there was another case that has become sort of gone viral. This was has everybody in the gun community polarized on one side or the other. Protesters broke down the gates to a private community. They marched through this very posh neighborhood, and fearing for their lives and their homes, supposedly fearing for their lives, but fearing for their homes, a couple whom we will simply call Ken and Barbie armed themselves, stepped out onto the front lawn in full view of the crowd. At some point, were exchanging words with the protesters that were walking the street and up the sidewalk in an attempt to dissuade them from approaching their house. One of them had an AR-15, the other had a small handgun. And now we've all seen the case. I don't want to argue the merits of the case of the couple involved, whether or not they should be charged or not. Let's talk about whether or not this was a smart decision. This time, it's not your business; it's your home. This ties more closely back to episode 85, like I mentioned earlier. What should Ken and Barbie have done in this situation?
Well, if you would have asked me that a week ago, I probably would have given a different answer than I would give now at this moment, because if you haven't, for our audience, I know that you've, Lloyd, have read this because you were the one who shared the article on Facebook. But if you haven't read the latest in the case by now, the pistol that the wife was holding was inoperable and unloaded. The AR-15 that the husband was loading, or was armed with, was likewise unloaded. And knowing those facts, it was incredibly stupid for them to do what they did. Because if anyone had called their bluff, they'd both be dead. They both would be dead. Their house would likely be burned to the ground and any valuables taken out. So, God was smiling upon them that day. But for me, it was incredibly stupid. If you're going to give the appearance of defending your life with lethal force, it's a good idea to make sure that you are using actual lethal force or equipped to do. I mean, if the and I don't know what you want to call them, demonstrators, whatever, activists, if they had decided, nah, they're not going to pull that trigger and charged at the guy, it would have ended very badly. He wouldn't have had time to say, "Oh crap, stay right there. Let me run back inside and grab a magazine that's loaded."
Yeah, I was inclined initially. I guess we are going to get into the details of this case. I was inclined initially to be more sympathetic to them. Finding this out. Now we find this out because it turns out that the district attorney took Barbie's gun, the handgun, and made it operable in order so that they could charge them. But regardless of that, ignoring that fact, the fact, like you said, that they went out in their front yard with guns that they knew weren't going to work, and tells me they did this for show. And this wasn't because they weren't serious about defending their property.
Right.
If you're serious, you go out there loaded for bear, and if somebody comes and threatens you, then you're ready to light them up. I mean, like we said earlier, if you're going to go to the gun because you have no fallback position, you've now gone to the full extreme, right? You've brought out the nuclear missiles. There's no way to actually back down from this now. So if you've gone to that point and you're doing it with unloaded weapons, you've got nothing. All you're doing is trying to shake a stick at them and hope that they'll be scared or something. I mean, you're not.
Hold your gun up in the air and yell bang, bang, bang and hope you fool them. You know, it's.
This is not serious.
No, and I will give them the benefit of the doubt in this way, that the actions that they took, obviously they were convinced were necessary to dissuade any violence from falling upon them. You know, and this was a gated area. It was private property. It was not on the, and I don't know what led these these thugs, these demonstrators, these rioters to go towards their home. In that regard, I would say, if it was me, I would have been legitimately concerned for my safety, and I probably would have, maybe I wouldn't have come out of my house with my firearms, but would have stood by a window watching and waiting. But
yeah, let's go there for a second. That's
Sure.
a good point. We sort of talked about some of these situations or scenarios in episode 85, so I would encourage you to go back and listen to that full discussion. But let's say they did take this seriously and they did have loaded weapons and they were fully prepared to defend their property and their lives with lethal force. Is it smart to go walk out in the yard in front of a mob?
Right.
No. It's even more stupid to do it with a gun that's not loaded and then to engage in some sort of verbal back and forth with the protesters, because you're just encouraging them to come and beat your ass.
Yes.
Now, sorry, I couldn't. I don't know whether I should bleep that out or whether that's just natural. That maybe it's better if we just leave it.
It's also a term for a donkey, so
It's also a donkey or a Democrat. So,
well, here's and this is one of those things where I would have liked to know a little bit more information, because depending on the news release that you would have read, it doesn't make it clear whether this gate was access only to their residence or a number of residences. So if there were multiple residences that this gate served as an access point for, then I would have been inclined to say, you know what? Why don't you wait to make sure that they're targeting your property before you do anything? Because from the sound of it, This was a private gated community where was it the mayor's house also was in this area?
I think so.
And so it leads me to believe that their house wasn't even the intended target of these protesters, these demonstrators. So
yeah. This from everything that I've seen now, especially this latest revelation about the guns and their capability of actually being deployed properly, tells me this was nothing but a stunt.
Yeah.
And they were not at all serious about self-defense. And like we said earlier, if you're going to go to the point of defending yourself and you're determined that you need a gun to do it, to bring an unloaded gun to that fight is hilariously stupid.
Yeah.
And if you really did think that you were in danger, if your life was in danger, would you go out in the middle of your yard, yell at and antagonize the mob while holding a gun that you know you can't use except as a club?
Yes. Yeah. It makes no sense.
It doesn't. It doesn't make sense at all. So the better thing to do here would be Barbie shouldn't have had the gun waving it around, pointing at everybody. She should have been on the phone with 911 while Ken was at the door with the out of harm's way. Because what if somebody in the crowd had a gun and decided, oh man, I feel threatened by this guy, and they take a shot at him? Well, he's standing out in his yard. He's an easy target. The smarter thing to do is to be in a position where you are not an easy target and you can more easily defend your life and your property if that mob decides, hey, we should go attack this guy's house.
Yes, and as obviously these two had absolutely no training, and I feel a little bit better about the fact that they were using unloaded firearms, because it's clear from the video that they had absolutely no muzzle control whatsoever. But one of the main concepts when it comes to any sort of defensive action is having a point of cover from which to defend yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You're standing out. I mean, what are you going to do? Try and duck behind the closest shrub? My gosh.
And with that pink golf shirt, he's not exactly going to blend in with his surroundings. So
it wasn't pink; it was salmon.
Oh yes, of course. That's much better. All right. So to summarize all of this craziness, and to sort of respond to give Dana a good answer here, the attitude of the Christian gun owner, should any self-defense situation arise, should be to avoid situations where you might need to use a gun. Don't go looking for a fight, especially if you're armed. And if you're armed, have a firearm that actually functions. Focus on defending yourself and your family and not picking a fight, and kind of keep your ego in check, right?
Right, yeah. Your priority is protecting the life of the innocent. And, we're not going to go the John Piper route and say that we have a obligation to preserve the life of the violent criminal. But it's... If there is ever any way to de-escalate a situation, that should be your first go-to. Your first automatic response. Now, if the person is armed, then yes, you can go to having to use lethal force if necessary. But that shouldn't be the your first response when met with an aggressor, if there is no reason to justify the use of lethal force. If you can get out of that situation without drawing your firearm, do it.
Yep. You'll never lose a gunfight that you don't get into.
Exactly. And that's the other thing, is that whenever you are in a situation where you get to the point where lethal force becomes necessary, there's never any guarantee that your life is going to be spared that day. Not to mention,
Yes.
even if you do happen to survive, the legal ramifications that come with it can ruin the life that you have left.
All right, folks, I think that's puts a lid on it, I think, wraps a bow around it nicely. Thank you, Pastor.
Hey, it's been enjoyable. It's been too long since we've done this. I'm glad to do it again.
It has been way too long. Good to sort of be back in the batter's box, so to speak. That's all the time we've got today, folks. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen and sticking around with us. And let us know what you think about anything that you heard here today, good, bad, or indifferent. If you agree with us, if you disagree, visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. You can send us a voicemail or a voice message with your computer audio, your computer's microphone, or you can send us an email there. We'd love to hear from you and respond to you on the show like we did with Dana's message today. Visit us again next week. We're going to have our variety show next week with content from the entire cast, and then the week after that for episode 229 we'll be back again for another episode of Clinging to God and Guns right here on Armed Lutheran Radio. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
John Bennett is the pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. For more information, visit stjohnswillowcreek.org. For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback or a review on iTunes and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.